Welcome back, people. Welcome back. How great is it to be alive? Buzzing with energy, man. This is so good. This is genuinely, we were just talking
The
about this.
crowd,
This
the
is
crowd erupts.
exactly. I thought there would only be 5 people watching this, but seems like there's a few more brothers joining us by the campfire, right?
Yeah, and sisters. There's
Hmm.
yeah, I know from a few people and people that I've recommended this to. Yeah, it's landing within in different ages as well, different audiences. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah, so we're back on Luca Teller's official YouTube page. It's a privilege for me to be here, to be the host. It's a privilege for you to be here, to be the guest. And yeah, today we're going to continue with this mammoth series that we're undertaking, Aristotle's Metaphysics. We've taken it sort of chapter by chapter, book by book, based on our natural aptitude and energy levels, and just kind of segmented it however we can so far. It's been pretty clean, and we'll try and keep it that way as well, just for the sake of optics. I guess it's cleaner and it's easier that way, and it's also better to systematize your own thought if you have sort of clear boundary lines. So today we'll be focusing on sort of an interregnum chapter or book, you could call it. It's called Alpha the Lesser in my translation. It acts as like a bit of a go-between before Aristotle really launches into some of his key concepts and puzzling questions in book beta. So yeah, it's at the tail end of the meaty chunk of Alpha, but it's still officially a part of Alpha. It's a sort of a middle period, middle like dissertation, if you will. So we'll talk a bit about that. But firstly, welcome back, Alex. How thrilled are you about life?
I'm so stoked to be here. It's my favorite day of the week. That's why I've put on a shirt, here to discuss Aristotle and to look as good as I can while I do it.
Yeah, you didn't have the shirt on before we hit record, though. But yeah, all right. Yeah, glad to have you here, man. I think we'll stick to the format we've sort of kept up in the last few conversations as well, of having a bit of a recap. So did you want to start that? Any thoughts and reflections or musings about the episode last time, and even not even about the concepts and thoughts necessarily, but how it made you feel, and if you had any updates in the last week?
I can remember that after that conversation, I was just full of like helios, like just illumination and lightheartedness. And I was just, almost floating, but still like, it was just that vertical axis that had been opened. So it was through the relationships, through people I was seeing and activities I was doing, just felt connected right back to, an ontological depth. And yeah, and also being very present and grounded firsthand. So there was definitely felt like we hit into that rhythm, and we did really, go quite far in that conversation, even between me and you, Luca. Generally over the time we've known each other, I feel like we really pushed and tested our limits, and that this series has been really helping us to do that and asking it of us, to come to understand and grasp, to wrestle with Aristotle. It forces us to push our own limits and grow our understanding. So had a really amazing effect. I'd be curious to hear the same for you before I get into a bit of a recap of that.
Yeah, at the pathic layer, I felt very similar. I felt like it was a peak so far, one of many peaks to come, I'm hoping, but definitely an overall high moment. And yeah, it did feel like we stepped up to the mark, but also that there was a calling from the other side pulling us towards it. So I felt that levitating sort of vertigo feeling throughout the week as well, just kind of elated about the depth we encompassed, I guess, depth and breadth. And yeah, it felt like it was just a wide array of things that we went over, both in terms of the points we wanted to cover more theoretically, and then also I feel like it was a very boundaries heavy conversation where we were able to test limits across all layers of being, in a sense. And we talked a bit about faith, how it pertains to reason, truth. The general discussion, if you haven't seen it, was just about Plato versus Aristotle's, I guess, contemplations directly or indirectly on the forms, because it's not explicitly stated, I suppose, in any one place, except a little bit that we get in the Republic from Plato. But yeah, if you haven't seen it, on screen now. Yeah, definitely one of the most enjoyable discussions I've had in the last year or so. So yeah, if you want to give a more sort of thorough recap of the ideas, let's hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from outset it was pretty important, I felt, that we actually gave Plato the full treatment, and that we didn't restrict ourselves to the analysis that Aristotle gives and stay within that framework to understand Plato, because there is a lot more scholarship that's been done recently, and intellectual, and I also want to say more comprehensive and holistic philosophy being done using Plato as a real inspiration. And we've seen that in many contemporaries today that are doing philosophy and have taken large influence by Plato. And so drawing on those sources, we really decided to seek to understand Plato's thought forms and get close to them at a experiential level, rather than from the textbook or from the deduction or from the arguments side, because we know that that has its own innate limits of things we can put into logic, things we can put into words. That's not the character of all of our experience. There's a lot of mystery that surrounds it. And so therefore we needed to lose sight of the shores, in a sense, of Aristotle in the book The Metaphysics, to then understand Aristotle's, great teacher and leader, and Plato. So we did that intentionally from the start, and I think it was helpful to, not have to stay as close to the text in that episode, but could really bring forward what was authentic for us, which was engaging with contemporaries and engaging with Plato, and bringing our own sets of challenges and issues to it. One of the key things we identified was the difference between informative wisdom and transformative wisdom. And it felt like our reading in book Alpha of the Metaphysics, Aristotle was giving an account of informative wisdom, knowledge of first principles and causes, but Plato, through his conception and contemplation of the forms, was giving us a more transformative account of wisdom. I really like that distinction, and it rhymes too, so that's a bonus. Yeah, something else that we spent a lot of time at the start with was understanding how actually a lot of the conceptions we have of Plato are misguided, don't fully encompass and give honor to the structure of the dialogues as a work of literature. A lot of them are concerned with the dialogues and with Plato's own form of thinking as propositional, and we can characterize the arguments given by characters and strip them from their context and then analyze them. And so when we even say things as the theory of the forms, implicit within that grammar is a certain set of values, right? That values Plato's work as theoretical, as intellectual. And there's a lot of evidence coming from third wave Platonism, which actually points to the participatory aspects of the dialogues, and how through the movement of the back and forth of the characters has the same phenomenological imprint on us, such that when we're reading this text and reading dialogues, we are also in flow with that participation. So that's a different way to see this dialogical component of the dialogues. And it's an example of why you need to dispel a lot of what you would hear in academia about Plato. It's there's emergent understanding more recently that we're getting to, which really grounds itself in a deeper aletheia and revealing of Plato's philosophy itself. We also connected it to Heidegger, even through the Heideggerian concept of aletheia and reality kind of revealing or becoming known, as analogous to the Socratic aporia and the moments in the dialogue where characters come to an end and have been full of a journeying conversation, but then all of a sudden a question further and find they don't have the answers, that actually their wits have run out and they're left in this silence or this pondering that is very deeply entrenched, within a participatory relation to reality. And that's where the aletheia and the revealing happens, and that's where the fullness comes alive, is in the silence, and when you have finally come to an end of your a priori knowledge. There was a few other things we talked about, just to touch on them quickly. One of them was the nothingness in Plato and Heidegger's concept. Like, Heidegger has a book, Being and Nothingness, and we really went to understand how the role of lack and nothingness comes into such a positivistic philosophy. And it was almost the lack and the gaps in our understanding which drives and compels the movement towards the forms, and also their ever deepening revealing to us, and their growth, because we never can capture the concepts and ideas in totality, but we can always put ourselves in relation to them, and in that relation you have the experience of otherness and lack and almost a gap in understanding, which is ever present, sort of at the borders, and then you realize the borders are all around, and it becomes quite a significant part of it. So that was our musings and our deep discussion and back and forward on the preciousness of life, and we had to preciously treat the preciousness of life, as you had said. So that's a quick summary of previous episode. Definitely check it out if you haven't already.
That preciousness quote was mine. I get paid 7 cents every time someone uses it. Yeah, when I was reflecting on the discussion, first of all, really nice summary there. Yeah, I think that touched on all the key points really cogently and succinctly. A couple of words that came to mind upon reflection during the week were the words falling into as a theme of the discussion. Existentialism, definitely. I mean, you can't really evade existentialism when you're talking about Heidegger. Maybe he would place himself as in that bracket or not, I don't know. But the other word was definitely relational, and like a inherent or innate dynamism in things that we were trying to honor as well. We were honoring the spirit of the discussion, which is, following the logos, and in the search for truth, the prime motive of philosophy, you have to dispel truth at times, right? You have to negate the thing you are most searching for. You have to sacrifice. Sacrifice is another word that invokes a lot of moral charge. And we also spoke about the leap of faith, the primacy of unreason at times. So there was definitely like a submerging feel to the discussion, where you have to let go of your individual identity as you step into the battleground. And in doing so, you find yourself ever anew. So I would also just say that credit to us, that you'd require a bit of healthy extraction, the faculty of distillation. You have to be able to wrestle with these ideas. For that, you need to pick them out off the page, send it over to someone, have them send it back to you, and actually receive it charitably, nurture it, do your thing with it, send it back. And that's, like a non-combative part of dialectic as a process as well. So Yeah, through the one, the many are discovered. Through the many, the one is enlivened and discovered as well. And that's almost like the textbook definition of complexification. You know, when there's a simultaneous integration and differentiation, a higher transcendent whole arises out of that. And I feel like there was something, yeah, definitely something poetic in the last discussion happening alongside the theoretic, both kind of sublating and helping and feeding into one another. So I second everything you said. And yeah, are we happy to get into it then?
Yes, happy to get into it. I just hesitate because there was one other important idea and frame that you had just touched on, which was almost the beyondness of the objects that we perceive. And when you give it that close reading and kind of phenomenological contemplation, you find that there's a kind of receding of the object such that your grasp can never fully encompass it. And that is also the revelation and the building of your relationship to that object through your perception. So perception as relationships that we engage in, and you can deepen these relationships just by pouring more attention and mindfulness to them. And I think when you apply that to yourself as well, you can experience firsthand what it feels like to be simultaneously yourself and beyond yourself, and to occupy those two positions. And I think that is a idea which is not foreign to philosophy, that has been there in Socrates and all the way through and through mystical teachers. And it was interesting to arrive there. And for us in our discussion, we thought about how even one instance of how that shows up is, from a Jungian lens, looking at the collective unconscious as something that is transcendently beyond you. It's a collection, like a collective memory reservoir that speaks through images and constellations and can inform different periods of your life with certain intensities. And yeah, it just points to the fact that there is that quality of beyondness that exists and that we participate in as well. And that is just the norm of being human.
Yeah, and that rigorous philosophy is not something we would discredit from Aristotle, but maybe honoring something that is mythopoetic and not you, but autonomous and sovereign and contributory to your being. Like that's something that Aristotle continually underprivileges. We spoke about in the first two discussions about that. And yeah, I love the phrase you used about in order to honor being, you have to lose sight of the shores. And that's definitely something we endeavored to do with Plato. You have to forget the fact that we're looking at it going back through history, reverse chronologically through Aristotle and back into Plato. Try and just be there in the dialogue. Treat the symposium as a symposium. Treat whatever you're engaging with as the thing itself, insofar as we're capable to do so. And yeah, with the Heidegger stuff, I couldn't agree more. I think it just reminded me how the fundamental currency of lived experience and reality is attention and awareness. And it's kind of like where your eyes go, your heart follows. So yeah, that's definitely something that was another energy that was present. So that's pretty much all from me vis-a-vis the recap.
Yeah, I might be buggering this pronunciation, but André Gide was a French author, and he had the quote, which you referenced: "One does not discover new lands without consenting to lose sight of the shore for a very long time." And I guess it does point to our aspirational journey here, and especially as exemplified in the last episode, where, going back in history to recover and reconnect with philosophers, you have to, almost lose sight of what is comfortable and familiar here and now. And it's also just that, connecting it back to Jung, that process of to really step into the beyondness of yourself. You have to let go of the ego. You have to allow, the ego self access to be your path that you travel down. And it's tough to do that. It's a struggle. We're so connected to the material things and circumstances of life, that we are grasping them too tightly. And if we could only relax our grasp, then it gives us a bit more flexibility and cognitive flexibility to go to these places. So, Luca, what are we discussing today?
No, there's too much in that. I have to say something to that now, because that's evoking all the beautiful Zarathustrian imagery of carrying your own ashes up a mountain and having the strength to be a murderer, So yeah, that's really the like almost the primordial task. If you were given a manuscript when you were born, that would be the only thing written in bold letters at the top is, are you able to constantly die, and can you do so gracefully? And isn't that the task of philosophy as well, teaching you how to? So yeah, so are we going to start this discussion, or do you have something to say about that?
One more.
Okay.
And I bet that my one more probably gives you another riff too. Yeah. It touches on something that has so much personal depth to me. And I think about this as philosophy being the hourglass of identity. It really is like carrying your ashes. And I think what we find in those ashes is like what has passed through the hourglass. Like what starts in the hourglass is what we perceive as real, what we believe is certain, and what we desire to be actual. And when that hourglass is flipped, when the real comes in, like when death comes in or love flings open the door, that's when it's really tested. When relationships, betrayal comes in, that's when this place and experience of reality is turned in such a significant way. And a lot of that death that gets flipped. And this is all something that happens over time in like multiple instances. Hence the hourglass is just like a crazy symbolic condensement of that. And I think there's a real also spiritual struggle in this. And I think it's like the role of the shaman, is to not care about that identity. They kind of go right through with it and realize that your identity isn't something that like can necessarily ground you in the ways that you would hope, because of the intrusion of the real and what that does to your identity. But it's like it's understanding and integrating into your worldview that your identity doesn't ground out, it bottoms out, and it actually opens into the void. And that is actually what you rest on, that you have a resting place in this flux. And so, I mean, you can tell the deep work that it takes for that to be your operating place, and you need to constantly renew it. And it's, that's all I'll say on it at the moment.
Resting place in flux. Could you be more Hegelian?
Right.
Yeah, I love that phrase, intrusion of the real, because that's what it feels like. You think we even use the phrase lived reality, and we're just going about our day, la-di-dying, living our life. But all of a sudden the real hits you and you think, so what has everything else been? Optical delusion is probably the answer. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately as well, is truth. When we're going to be talking about causes, because we're talking about Aristotle. We'll get to him eventually. Don't worry, he features in this conversation too. But in trying to identify causes nested in a wider hierarchy of search for truth proper, I've been thinking so much about how that search may well just be subtractive and not additive. And you mentioned something about, yeah, I mean, even with the hourglass symbol, right? It's already there. It's passed through you. It's the contents are there. And so we've talked about philosophy as physiology. Maybe it's philosophy as alchemy, washing away everything that isn't there. And I just wanted to read out this. I came across this Tolstoy quote earlier this week. He writes, "Truth, like gold, is to be obtained not by its growth, but by washing away from it all that is not gold." And it just reminds me, like, probably my favorite person to ever exist is Michelangelo. And he also says something similar about, I simply carved away everything that wasn't David, you know? And it's again, the recognition, the identification, the aspiration toward truth as a subtractive endeavor, not additive. So yeah, that definitely stuck out to me. And to you, sir. Now, let's see what you have to say about this.
Truth is subtractive, philosophy is alchemy. Come on. Yeah, I think philosophy is physiology and philosophy is alchemy are very resonant with each other. I think they're saying a lot of the same thing. At least that's how I interpret philosophy as physiology, which maybe we haven't unpacked kind of totally. No, I won't take this on any further. At least we have to redo this and actually talk about Aristotle.
Okay, well, we kind of briefly touched on the stuff he starts Alpha the Lesser, this whole book with anyway, which is caring about truth. And if he kind of builds this frame that if we want to care about metaphysics, the first thing we have to care about is truth with a capital T. And in the search for truth, we're doing philosophy, because philosophy is the highest endeavor and truth is the most noble thing to find and the most helpful. Even he doesn't shy away from utility as well. Like, we can live the most virtuous and flourishing life if we have truth by our side. So, and then he says something like, proper to the search of truth or for truth is identifying and recognizing causes and making them as comprehensible as possible to us. So yeah, I guess to get it started then, the first thing we spoke about that he wrote at the start of Alpha altogether was that all men by nature desire to know. And we had a brief back and forth about, the varying levels to which we agree on that statement.
Or in a Lacanian way, which just came out as a slip that I picked up on. All men by desire nature to know.
Yeah. There's probably more gold in that, right? But yeah, he starts this part of Alpha with a similar kind of outlandish statement, I would say. He says something about all men or all people by nature have an aptitude to philosophize. We just do it to varying degrees based on our kind of aptitude, I guess, or underlying skill level. Then he goes on to say something like, something I do resonate a lot more with, which is that one way in which people philosophize and differentiate in the levels and the degrees to which they're doing so skillfully is by whether or not they're doing it as a group activity with other, esteemed individuals, or are they just doing it non-collaboratively. And he would lessen that as a mode of engagement. So yeah, right off the bat, like, I kind of disagree with the first thing he says, that I genuinely don't think people have any sort of innate desire towards truth or knowledge, or any proclivity that leads us towards kind of pull that he thinks we have. I don't really understand, but I do understand, and I do like the fact that he says that it's a collaborative endeavor. So any thoughts on that, sir?
Yeah, we talked about in one of our first discussions, and almost, I know Aristotle is talking about capital T truth and linking knowledge into our innate desire, but I talked about wondering if what he meant by knowledge was something a little bit closer to what Viveki might understand as relevance realization, and just the fact that in our day-to-day lives we are constantly striving to perceive concepts and to understand happenings and to put names to activity, almost like in the beginning when God names something and thereby it becomes actual, like that divine logos, the cosmic logos that is God. We are made in the image of God, and we have an image of that logos, which is to give an account of things. So I'm wondering less if it's like actually humans kind of then like by nature want to find their way through lots of different sense data towards like what is true, but is it more just our general cognitive beingness, like our nature there is to, you know, have understanding rather than not, or to, yeah, it's also like intuitively just beyond what I'm able to really describe, but that's the general gist and feeling that I would give to that specific part. I don't know if you had anything to say on that.
Yeah, no. On second thought, knowledge, as described by him, is probably closer to homeliness and existential homeliness rather than understanding in the 21st century per se. So yeah, like we said the phrase "fall into reality." By knowledge, he probably does mean like phronesis. He probably does mean a falling into being. So yeah, just that basically.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and the second part of humans actually having a better go at getting to truth when it's done collectively, when it's done with sort of many voices. We had in the last episode talked about, you know, distributed cognition that had come up a few times. And I think it is, and what we see here in Alpha the Lesser is Aristotle making it quite explicitly clear how, as part of his method of philosophy and part of, you know, his method of philosophy is one of the greatest contributions that he makes because it, you know, puts the foundations there for science and is still in some ways carried forward in practice today, where, yeah, as part of philosophy and as part of science, there should be discourse with other subjects so as to locate and identify the reality of which you are seeing. So when you can get these multi aspects to it, and when you can talk to someone like having done an experience or seen something, I think back in Aristotle's time, like it's, you know, going out and finding different species of plants or animals, or looking at their different stages of development. And I think in that, there were no textbooks to read on the subject. They were the pioneers of the subject largely. So to then grow the limits, to push the boundaries in what is known, you had to have that intersubjective agreement. And for Aristotle, this was super important in getting at anything close to approximating the truth, because otherwise we just have fantasy and we just have like radical subjectivity. And so Aristotle, and I bet as kind of taught by Plato, had this dialogical form implicit within his method that has become really successful. Like it is kind of having your ideas and your thoughts be fact checked by people around you. So I think it's you know, just to give some more appreciation to the depth of what he's saying here.
Yeah, well said. And I think the way he protects himself from that radical subjectivity you touched on is he says something in that same little spiel about how you touch truth, but you do not possess it. And so he does say like you are touching truth, but it's like a fragmentary perspectival approach. Again, perspectivism or perspectivalism, distinct from relativism. You know, we're not talking about well, that's just your opinion, man, you know. And he says something like the investigation of truth is both difficult and easy. And he's kind of paying homage to the kind of, again, like the trickster nature of truth, like the elusive nature, I guess. You engage in truth seeking and you will inevitably hit it multiple times by accident, but not exactly it. So you won't get the bullseye on the dartboard, but you'll be, you know, near and there kind of. So yeah, it's kind of Chomskyan, you know, like it to say that individuals, yes, we have our thresholds, we have our limits, we have our biases, we're partial, we're sickly, but we're not nothing. And so we are the building, we are active contributors in truth seeking. And yeah, I think he, for his time especially, Aristotle does do well to pay ode to that.
He does well. Yeah, he does well.
I'm also
Yeah.
thinking about the wider context and how this, what he writes in this part of Alpha the Lesser might actually just be a nascent form of what we call perspectivism today. I can't remember too many other thinkers from that period talking about the endeavor of truth seeking in this way, in such a like compelling and engaging and now 2300 years later still relevant way.
Yeah, I think you take Aristotle's perspectival approach and you add just a bit of nihilistic relativism, and then you get perspectivism. Like it needs to almost, yeah, encounter the post-tragic of that. Whoa, if we all just agree about some things, then it becomes actual, and it becomes solidified, and we all pledge our belief to it. We find that actually then when you get this global expansion of thought and you become cross-cultural and you become real overthinkers, then you actually see how that again doesn't ground out because it's intersubjective agreement, almost giving something identity, that bottoms out, and you then need to, in perspectivism, hold that as the backdrop and still go to a perspective, and go to the greater perspective of all, that are none on themselves sufficient, but as a pragmatic choice is correct.
Yeah, I just 2 days ago I was thinking, what would Aristotle think about structuralism? Like, would his brain just melt? And the answer is no, because he had the computational horsepower to foresee much of this. And he even, like, the first thing he says is like, yeah, we have the forthcoming problem of infinite regression. And so here's my rebuttal to that. And he takes a long time to answer that comprehensively, because he knows people are going to be like, but what caused that? But what caused that? And then the first cause problem, it's like, it's just this elephant in the room sitting in the corner of all philosophical discussion. So at first I thought, if you kind of posit that knowledge is nothing but nodes within a wider system of entrenched relations, like the average Greek philosopher of that time would just disintegrate on the spot, but maybe not Aristotle,
Yeah, maybe not, though he was a deep substance metaphysician, and I feel like that has some weaknesses when it comes to post-structuralism.
We also talked about his kind of avoidance of that leap of faith, and so much of what he's doing here is trying to repudiate groundless thinking. But something me and you have talked about privately before is learning how to ground yourself in that which you know full well is ultimately ungrounded, and that being a weakness of fundamental substance thinking, right?
Yes, and why it becomes very interesting when the Hegelian enters the picture, and yeah, that's kind of where I locate that being like clearly articulated. And I think Hegel, as he almost gets mentioned in every episode, is someone we're bringing into this dialogue, and yeah, so I appreciate the ways in which we are bringing these sets of challenges to Aristotle. And I think to, yeah, even in what we've been saying in a almost fragmentary way about these different aspects of truth, and how Aristotle, what he's doing in this first section of and in Alpha the Lesser, is giving an account of how metaphysics and truth should be pursued, what some of its difficulties and drawbacks are, like giving us some of the qualities of what it's like to be searching for the truth. So it's very much, it's almost procedural in a way. It's like the activity of getting somewhere, and just what the nature of that activity looks like, feels like, You can tell it's a little bit emotional even. Yeah, Aristotle, although he's pretty dry, as we've sort of said, we know he does obviously have like such a great grasp of the emotional and the emotive, and the poetic. And you can tell very subtly like where his jokes are and where his emotions really are. And I can tell he's struggling with this in this chapter in a way. And so, yeah, it's kind of a roadmap, and it doesn't lay out his doctrines. Like, we're not here to understand, exactly what Aristotle thinks truth is, or exactly what are like some of the axioms for his metaphysics. That comes later. But it's, yeah, how you steer the course. And I think, and I'll end with this, is just to read out the very first couple of sentences from Alpha the Lesser. And like, now, after talking about this for some time and thinking about the ways in which truth is difficult to attain on your own, and we need that intersubjective agreement, we have to be in deep dialogical discourse, and only through that journeying and almost, truth is subtractive from our stripping away of different components, we get closer to the real. Kind of, I think it's a nice way to actually end with the quote rather than beginning with it. So I'll just read it out. The investigation of the truth is in one way hard, in another easy. An indication of this is found in the fact that no one is able to attain the truth adequately, while, on the other hand, we do not collectively fail, but everyone says something true about the nature of things, and while individually we contribute little or nothing to the truth, by the union of all, a considerable amount is amassed. Thoughts and feelings?
Could you read out that last part again? By the union of all.
A considerable amount is amassed.
That's almost like so he does care kind of thing, like if we all just, bandy together, then maybe we can do something. And yeah, no, I definitely think there's little peaks and little elements of him kind of being witty and comedic as well. Like, yeah, it's lecture notes and they're rugged and uncompressed, but there was actually a quote. I'm jumping the ship here a bit, but I'll read it out. And some people will not accept a speech unless it is made in mathematical style, and others only if it does not use examples, and others demand that a poet be dragged in as a witness. And some say all things accurately, while others are offended by exactitude either because they cannot grasp it or because of its brevity. For accuracy has a feature like this, so that, as with agreements, so in arguments it strikes some people as illiberal. So yeah, definitely jumping around a bit there. That's something we'll get to about, the exactitudes inherent in various fields of study. But he does kind of just have these brief moments where he does that. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, it's, in a sense, in the linear character of the text jumping ahead, but it was like jumping the very next step. It was the reason why. It was very connected to the quote I had read. And I think, it's partly like the reason why as a collective we do much better than as an individual when our sights are the truth. And it's because each person has so many different gifts to offer, unique talents, unique histories and ways of seeing things. And I think, like, yeah, societally we have different roles and different jobs, and we do that because it's what we've learned and what we're best at. I think when you put those different perspectives into dialogue and, yeah, test out the different aspects of a theory or of a something more substantial, that's when it can really stand forth as, yeah, this stood up to the test of the poet and of a teacher, and of a general. And I think it's like it also at that point transcends just the social agreement and really comes more in contact with the real. Like, it's not just to find something that everyone is agreeing on or functionally thinks that, yeah, okay, pragmatically we can agree to this. Like that's part of it, I guess, but I really want to see it get to a foundation where truth, as we see from examples like number and mathematics and physics, truth becomes something where we do make real epistemic contact with the real, and yeah, we do land on something like truth.
Yeah, and the other half of that I keep hearing is that there's the field itself calling out for something, and then us trying to post hoc, like, not put something that's square into a circle. So like he says somewhere, I think it's either in the Poetics or in the Ethics, about the absurdity of demanding strict demonstrative reasoning from a rhetorician. It's like, yeah, when you're engaging in dialogue, of course it's going to be collaborative because it's going to be chunky and, again, like, unpolished, like we're not asking for, nor is it a demand of the field itself, for you to prove something rather than persuade something. There's sort of, yeah, different modes of engagement as per the field of engagement. So yeah, there's that aspect to it as well, where you have to pay heed to the subject that you're attending to and involved with, as much as the person that is the subject involved in the subject. So it's like a double, triple Venus trap almost.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that we've talked about in the first episode was how truth has such a strong subjective component, and that there's a polarity between what's subjective and what's objective. And so in a sense, to mediate that and to have a more adequate account of something, that's where, yeah, collectively we perhaps don't fail in that. I think like this is quite a fruitful line to take as well, like how well we're able to get to truth on an individual versus more collective basis. And like a point I was making before was how Plato sees truth as being relational in a sense. And so, yeah, you almost need multiple relations to then build up a kind of composite form of what this relation is. And then to speak to that is, yeah, almost to get outside of your own relations, you need other people, you need other perspectives to do that. We're so much better at giving advice to someone else than to ourselves. And it's a little bit like we are inherently our perspectives. Our subjectivity is deeply grounded in the worlds we know. And as like Nietzsche really points that out, again, like the subjective contributions, the personal unconscious contributions that are made to philosophy by philosophers that were unaware of their personal unconscious tendencies. And here we see Aristotle actually being able to point to this and understand it, but not. Yeah, it's an idea that grows and I guess does become a lot more clarified and articulated and integrated as a general mode of doing philosophy and science over time.
Yeah. And yeah, with Nietzsche, he talks about, not only we're not subjects with ego causes that have perspectives, we are the perspectives so wholeheartedly and so all-encompassingly that he uses the famous example of the lightning flash, right? And it's nothing but the prejudices of grammar and its limitations that compel us to say something like the lightning flashed, as opposed to the lightning just being fundamentally the flash itself. So I always love bringing in language into it. So yeah, that's definitely just part and parcel of us reading a Greek book in English as well. Like that's a factor here too. Yeah.
Yeah. And something else that Aristotle's doing in Alpha the Lesser is he spends a good amount of time, like, again, almost in book Alpha, he seems very strident and casts aside philosophers and sort of gets them wrong in doing that. He'll say these philosophers, these precursors, they had identified this cause or that cause, but they didn't have an integrated account. And here he says, actually, and I'll read, quoting, "The same holds good of those who have expressed views about the truth. For from me, thinkers we have inherited certain opinions, while others have been responsible for the appearance of the former." And he's talking about the way that, there's a sequential building on the philosophers that came before. Like Aristotle's here speaking to the way that without a Parmenides or a Heraclitus, or definitely a Plato, you wouldn't have an Aristotle. It's like standing on the shoulders of giants, is the way I think Einstein or Newton put it. And I think Aristotle does pay homage to that process. So it gives me now another reading on how he's viewing philosophers before him. It's adding a layer to that. We've kind of learned at the start that, okay, these philosophers are not sufficient. They weren't able to totally comprehend the truth. And now he's saying, but actually also they were definitely necessary for this whole project of the truth to continue. And we wouldn't have disciplines that we have today without people who were fumbling around getting it wrong to start with. So it's that emergentism of truth through people that Aristotle was deeply aware of.
Yeah, it's almost a split personality. The guy who's speaking in this section seems different. Like he's just dissociated from the guy that was just lambasting everyone that came before him in the previous section. And I think there's a cheekiness to this because he's trying to pinpoint something that is an intermediate cause, and he's now postulating that these contributors, these great figures of philosophy, were intermediate causes in getting to this standing on the shoulders of giants bridge that he's now sitting right in the thick of. And it's like, yeah, these guys led me to here, but ultimately I think he's wrong. Like it's almost as simple as saying, like, if they didn't, then someone else would. But yeah, I know there's definitely a beauty to the kind of complexity that he's pointing to, where they both, yeah, they exist in like a Schrodinger's cat dual reality type situation where, yeah, you do have to, Aristotle does do well to not lose sight of the fact that generally complexity is tied to contingency. So there's just that, yeah, again, that knife's edge nature to where we are, but yeah, it's like complex but beautiful, kind of.
Yeah, and it's not only about, oh, we needed people before to lay the foundations and take a step in this direction. He also wants to say, like, it's also the more difficult or wrong false beliefs that sharpen the truthful ones. Like if you have a mixture of sensibilities of the truth that are misguided, when you put them in that relational and dialogic context with other humans, it does help to actually sharpen and refine the ones that do hold ground. So yeah, there's more than one way in which earlier and wrong ideas are really useful to us in our search of truth. And I think it does, yeah, just bring in that deep element of like contrast into it. And we know that Aristotle was, especially in the ethical questions of life, like deeply appreciated the contrasts that different virtues had, where on the one hand something is courageous and on the other hand it's foolhardy, and that virtue is more like finding the right medium, like applying that as well to search for truth. It's you need that. Yeah, to me the sensation is like quite a sharp and cutty one, like glass or something. Like that's just, it's, you have to have the kind of fragmentary not quite wholeness of your method to really sharpen
it's the wayward pendulum swings that eventually zero in, right? He's not exactly saying things arise from their opposite. Like, we don't need to seek truth out of an initial wider pool of untruth, but they do arise from what at the time is a contemporary, like, known unknown, or even unknown unknown. The field of knowledge spreads on like infinitely, and like what we don't know, we famously now post Jung know that we drape in fantasy. And it's almost like you have to have the fantastical, the mythical, and like that will be scientifically objectively wrong, but that's the initial flurries and the paroxysms of the heart that eventually zero in on something we can rigorously replicate. And we know Aristotle loves replicability and something being only really truly skillfully ingrained in you if you can teach it. And to do that, it has to come down to the theoretic from the fantastic and the poetic initially. Which is why it's quite, I guess, paragonic to say that philosophy as alchemy, philosophy is birthed out of alchemy, you know, and it's not like chronologically or historically or anything, but there's a felt sense that it's like a wider pool out of which we extract that little vital source that we actually needed, but we really, really needed that encompassing thing, the field in which it's embedded.
Yeah. And I think it's almost like a microcosm and the macrocosm, where even in our own subjectivity and conscious perception, we rest on a much more expansive and totalizing unconscious. And I know it's a little bit like, this isn't settled science, but
it's a bro science.
Yeah, but like there's a lot to that, and I guess some of it is settled science in the sense of most of our cognitive processing is done unconsciously, and it's a very small amount that we have conscious awareness and conscious control over. And so it's, to me, it really points to some of the Jungian approach to this, and I'm thinking of the book The Origins and History of Consciousness, how even when we're looking at how structures of consciousness form, or for Aristotle, how truth comes to be known, there's a link between the psychic process and the external social context of that happening, from developing from this greater expansion into a more clarified and crystallized and known destination.
Which is why it would be interesting to ask Aristotle about free will, as a sort of intersection of causes and agent and arena relationships and existentialism. Like, where does he sit with the idea that we're actually doers committing deeds and active agents? Because if he could precipitate what happened in terms of our discovery of the dynamic models of the unconscious in the 18th and 19th centuries, I really do wonder what a sit-down interview with him like that would go like. Also, just his like pure writing style here, just as a bit of a tangent, it's so annoying. I felt like I was reading, it's lecture notes and it's uncompressed, and you don't need to like worry about publishing a book and sending it off to an editor or anything, but it does feel like traipsing through sludge, and not in the way that you would with like Kant, because it's just dense and conceptual and he's a bad writer, but in the way of like you're reading a 12-year-old's diary. Like, it's just a unfiltered, unfettered stream of consciousness at times, this book, So for those that are like following along but not reading the book, just know that it's not like one idea. Here's the like initial hypothesis. Here's my argument. Here are the possible anticipated counter arguments and the conclusion. It's not like that. It's just a completely uninhibited stream of consciousness from an inebriated Greek guy, because that's probably what he was.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, to the 95% that are not also reading this book along, you're welcome. There's so many hard yards and rereads to find discernibly what Aristotle is saying or what the cogent argument is. Yeah,
and then fit it into the wider web of people that came before and after him, and then try to like talk about it in a way where you're doing it with someone else and filtering what they're saying and saying something back. It's a mission. It's a welcome mission, but it's not nothing.
Yeah. Perhaps another aspect we can touch on in Alpha the Lesser, and I think it's also developed a bit more in the next book, so in the next episode, but that was how there's almost a different set of criteria or ontological ground for truth between different domains, like between different subjects, areas of study. The axioms that you're operating from are not going to be the same, and therefore universal truth is not. It's interesting because Aristotle does have this idea of the first cause, and he definitely has the universals and he has the universal, but knowledge of first principles and causes, he wants to say, doesn't wholly become something total, but that there is real differences between the subjects. And I think like a good example of this is to look at the truth of physics and the truth of biology, and just know that in the Einsteinian or Newtonian picture, what constitutes truth is so vastly different from evolved biological species. Almost like the physics of what's happening in the Darwinian fight for survival and propulsion of genes, and the fit and adaptive fitness to physical and social worlds, environments, like what constitutes true and therefore gives you right fitness to the world and like accurate predictions, that's completely different. Like it's about reproduction and survival in that context, and it's way away from truths of physics, which is again accurate predictions. And you could play around with, there's like semantic mismatches in a sense, but I think the essence of what I'm saying is still holds and is legit. And so it was also just reading that and reflecting on it, quite interesting that Aristotle was at that level, able to get there. And I think like he has a quote here on mathematics, and he says, kind of just the point I'm making, the minute accuracy of mathematics is not to be demanded in all cases, but only in the case of things which have no matter. Hence method is not that of natural science, for presumably the whole of nature has matter. Hence we must inquire first what nature is, for thus we shall see also what natural science treats of, and whether it belongs to one science or to more to investigate the causes and the principles of things. So in that, he's actually contrasting like the subject of mathematics and the subject of natural sciences, saying that mathematics isn't concerned with like the actual thingsness and materiality of the world, but it exists in that abstract space. Yeah. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think he does well to point that out, that some fields, such as mathematics, would require from you a formal structure and an account of an abstraction, and some would be the explicit opposite. Some would require informal unstructures, something like. And yeah, I think he does again well to integrate like laterally across the different natural fields and sciences. I'd find it even more amusing and peculiar what Aristotle would say, how he would attempt to integrate vertically with the knowledge we have now about the psyche and being and unconscious, subconscious, and conscious modes of being, which I think we've taken too far. Like we've definitely overcooked like the difference and conflated the map with the terrain with a lot of those models. But that would be like very interesting to hear as well. And also just what he would think about retroactively assigning false causes, and kind of the misbegotten adventures that people have when they reflect. Our faculties of judgment are like multi-layered and also erroneous, highly error prone. And like the impulse to assign a cause to something is excited and incited by basically any sensation that the nervous system feels. Like our memory just goes into overdrive trying to dig out these associated habituated patterns from our past, and seemingly at random assigns one by like randomness, by recollection. You could say last time this happened, that happened, so why would this time be different? And we just kind of just, for the sake of soothing ourselves and finding this palliative like remedy, we just assign causes. So I wonder what Aristotle would say about the like error prone, highly nervous, neurotic 19th century, say, individual, and how he almost swims and lives in like self caused delusion that way. Yeah, there isn't really a question there, but any thoughts would be welcome.
Yeah, it again is linking to like how science has become one of the dominant methods. And I guess what Aristotle is doing is we're seeing in Aristotle's method a really well thought out and well judged account of how we can do science and how we can almost like the role that errors have in science. But it seems like, we misinterpreted Plato by thinking he had a theory, and we misinterpreted Aristotle by thinking he had a method. Like, and what I'm kind of saying there is it's not a method, man. This is a philosophy. This is a way of life. This is a real intersubjective exchange and embodiment of ideas. And if we try and take this and run with it and say, okay, in science, we need to, minimize errors, make sure that this can be replicable, we can talk about it with people, but ultimately we are not the ones to be doing the observing. We need instruments. We need to instrumentalize our own measurement. We need to make things objective so that we can make them repeatable and predictable. And in so many ways, science absolutizes that method, spawned by Aristotle in a sense, but removes all errors removes our faculties of judgment in a sense, because our faculties of judgment have those errors. We have our own biases and prejudices, and those are things to contend with. And I guess in something as truthful, as truth-oriented as science, there is no room for the errors. And so we instrumentalize our perception and believe that we've found a method that gets us closest to the truth that we have ever been. But Aristotle might object to that and say, hey, if we're really removing the human in a big way, we're removing all the potentia for the sharpening of that truth.
Yeah, let the errors vacillate until they settle on something. And science itself is only objective in veneer, right? It's motivated by its own aims and limits and methods, and thinks it has a right of existence, but undergirded entirely by human ambition. So it's not, what we, even the distinctions we make at the core of philosophy between subject and object, generally those are illusory as well, I would argue. The subject is the object observing the subject simultaneously, and that just, again, you use the word interdependent, intersubject, subjective. Generally, when two entities collide into reality and into being, they are transjectivizing. They're not just one or the other. So it's almost like the core mode of operation is a fusion such that it's intelligible, because otherwise it wouldn't be. Like, it wouldn't be in both senses of the word be.
And what does the science look like that allows us to feel it? Yeah, and I don't want to be too naive here, but yeah, naturally, as Aristotle is able to point out, yeah, and also this isn't the weakness of science that it strips our creative judgment from it and removes subjective error. That is actually the greatest thing about science. But let's not worship
You need to
that.
totalize that. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a useful skill. It's a useful skill in boxes, but yeah, all boxes have a beginning and an end, right?
Yeah, let's put that in right relation to what else is there, which
And
yeah.
isn't Aristotle the philosopher of fittedness? Of even all the way down to his idea of form being a structural, organizational function, right? Fittedness also in the sense of golden mean, like the not the middle point, but the healthy mean between excess and deficiency. So it's almost like we're in the right place. We're under the tutelage of the right man if we want to be vivified and like fertile and virile and involved and active in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I'm going to have to go soon, so perhaps we can wrap this up, but open to any thoughts or musing that you still have that you want to cover, and also have a question in this, which is kind of a final piece of Aristotle's commentary here, is again to kind of deconstruct Plato's theory of form. So he's already not quite fitted to Plato and his theory of forms. Although I do like the philosopher of fitness is that's another great line that I'm sure will return for us. But like I'm saying he gets Plato a little bit wrong, but he's still got a pretty good criticism of it, because Plato is saying it and it is how we understand the forms. Like the ways in which the forms lead to, and the forms as what our intelligibility rests on, the forms as what we can rest our knowing on, how, can they be infinite? Can there be infinite forms, or is it right to even conceive of there being an infinite regress implicit within the forms? Like I'm wondering from you the role of infinity within certainty, and whether we have to find something that doesn't have a predecessor in a way. Like for Aristotle, the first cause was the thing that was for itself. And so I think a lot of these ideas are topical and will definitely come back up in future. But for here and now, like when we're talking about search for truth, is our infinities and almost runaway tangents and logical uncertainties, like, is the vagueness okay here?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have too comprehensive of an answer to that. It's a good note to end on, but in general, my heart goes towards the sentiment that yes, not only is vagueness okay, it's actively desirable. And I said something in the first episode about I find it to be a disheartening and like a actively like degenerating and sickly impulse to have this undying search and yearning for answers. So it does feel like a perfect note to close on because, yeah, I think when you're, first of all, like raising the question of infinite regress is such a stupid thing. Like, of course, I could have told you that when I was 10. But then there's the rebuttal to that, which is that, well, we have to draw the line at an intermediate cause that satisfies the conditions or the method in which we're something that's proximal and useful and here and now. And okay, so we'll just say this intermediate cause is going to be what's applicable. There's a sense to that. But again, there's a sickliness to that. It's almost, I don't want to say who cares, but I do want to say that as well. Like, what I'm so much more interested in that person asking that specific question than the content and the semantic of the question in that particular case. So yeah, I think when you're rummaging through series of causes, trying to find what's prior, this thing's predecessor, that thing's predecessor, what antecedes this, what succeeds that, you're depicting and portraying for yourself nothing more than a soothing picture of the world, which will successfully do what you seek it to do, and nothing more or nothing less. You're not engaging in truth seeking when you do that, when you're rummaging through the past for causes.
Yeah.
And I guess another note to end on would just be like an open-ended question. If you have any final thoughts, that's great. If not, we can end on this. But like, what do we make of fatalism? You know, what do we make of things just happening and there not being an interlocked web of motives? Is there a place even for fatalism? Is there like, is it contrary to and antithetical to everything we've been speaking about, or can it be dovetailed in?
Amor fati.
If I ever get a tattoo, it'll be that.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche has in all his nihilism, he has some hope and some truth, and he has like some absolute core H5 grade pillars that that he can like act positively on, rather than his doing of truth is subtraction. I mean, he's also very artful and free and light-hearted in a sense, but Amor Fati was one of the cards he needed to play to really get himself out of what you're describing. I think fatalism and eternal recurrence of the same, and it's through that radical acceptance. Yeah, so this is a sort of existential response to it, but I think that's kind of the right place to become existential in a way, and a good kind of personal way to end. But I think as well, like, there is very much an infinity in free will. There's an infinity of causes that had to happen for you to be here to make any decisions at all. So there's an infinite predetermination before you, but then there's also an infinite suggestion of choice that one must select from. And it's never going to be as black or white as, do we have free will? That is crazy.
No,
That
of
is
course. That's got to be
crazy.
the stupidest question in human English history, right? To be able to posit a question like, do we have free will or does God exist? Like,
But
come
like,
on now.
is it not like, this is the first thing that you question and get like, taught about in philosophy in some ways. And I feel like culturally there's still so much hang up on that. Maybe we're letting it go and moving through it.
And
But
where the
yeah, I think,
paranoia really sets in is like, yeah, eternal return of the same. But, and then this is Deleuze's repetition argument, what if it was eternal? The proper mode of engagement with eternal recurrence is to view it as eternal return of difference. What if it's difference that's eternally returning? And where does that leave you as as a Dasein?
Yeah. And I think like some of the principle in that of like why does free will exist isn't a great question. Some of that principle extends to a lot of questions and a lot of discussion and debate. Like, does God exist is almost in a similar vein. And like Eric Weinstein would say, can lead to a lot of unproductive engagements and arguments with people where you're having this discussion and argument, but really at the bottom is just this faith or determination that you already have. So we're engaging in this discussion about free will, but then ultimately determined to not be seeking alignment. And so it is, yeah, I think
I also think it's cognitively impossible to have your mind changed by watching a debate. So I don't know what, aside from just views, what is the reason for holding such forums, that's the other thing.
Yeah. No, I love how you ended this as well and bringing in Deleuze.
I'm going to talk more about Deleuze going forward in further episodes. I have some stuff I want to say about him, and I think he can be grandfathered in rather eloquently when talking about Aristotle and kind of modern, I don't want to say abnegations, but modern continuations or progressions of Aristotle, and how he, I think Deleuze epitomizes a lot of modern interpretation and growth of Aristotle's ideas.
Yeah, so why don't we...
This is a good place to end it
relish in the aporia and of our Dasein in this eternal recurrence of difference, and let that sit.
So this was meant to be a shorter episode. I don't think it turned out that way, but to all of those that have stuck around, thank you once again. And also thank us. This is the laborious task, right? So you guys should be commenting down saying thank you to you two for just absolutely sludging through this horror show of a book at times. Sometimes it's okay, but sometimes it's not okay. So yep, subscribe, do your thing. This is going to be ongoing. We're this far through the book, so not very far at all. Bros by the campfire, bringing you great knowledge that's going to change your lives irrevocably. So stick with us. Thank you, Alex, for being here, and see you guys next time.